General Hospital will reveal interesting facts on Tuesday, April 22, 2025. First, Kai stood alone in the quiet hospital room, the cold white light from the ceiling casting a sterile glow over his frail shoulders like an invisible curtain of pressure. Beneath the white bandages wrapped tightly around his aching abdomen were not just physical wounds, but an internal battle growing more intense by the hour. The risky surgery loomed above him like a sharpened blade, and it seemed as though everyone around him believed it would end in disaster. Some doubted his body could endure the procedure. Others were convinced he was deluding himself with hope for a miracle that didn't exist. Even in the worried glances of the nurses and the whispered conversations of passing doctors, it felt as if failure was already expected. But Kai didn't crumble under their doubt. Instead, he observed quietly and chose to place his faith in one person, Drew. Although Trina had always expressed her distrust toward Drew, believing he was hiding something, that he was not to be trusted, and that his every move carried a hidden agenda, Kai saw something different in the way Drew looked at him. It wasn't pity. It wasn't obligation. It was something deeper, steady resolve and genuine empathy. Others might focus on the charts, the risks, the percentages, but for Kai, what made him choose to face this life-threatening gamble was the quiet conviction in Drew's eyes, the look of someone who didn't want him to give up. Kai knew exactly what risks lay ahead. He'd heard all the warnings about potential paralysis, even death on the operating table. But he had also lived long enough with pain to know that without this chance, the days ahead would only stretch into endless suffering. While others tried to hold him back out of fear, Drew was the only one who reached out and offered a different path, a path filled with danger, yes, but not without possibility. That trust didn't come easily. It was built over countless sleepless nights as Kai questioned whether Trina might be right. Yet the more he watched Drew remain by his side, never pushing, never painting false hope, simply being there when needed, the more convinced Kai became that this time, he had to make the decision for himself. He was no longer the passive figure others controlled. He wanted to rise again, even if it meant facing death head-on. And so, despite the warnings, despite the quiet objections from both Trina and the medical team, Kai chose to move forward. He chose to believe in Drew, the man everyone doubted, but who, to him, had become the only anchor in this storm of life and death. Second, Lucky walked into the room as though he carried with him the oppressive weight of a coming storm. Darkness had begun to fall outside the window, but it wasn't nearly as heavy as the burden pressing down on his chest. This wasn't just another conversation. This was the confrontation he had been trying to avoid for days. But silence has its limits, and that limit had been breached the moment he realized that continuing to say nothing would make him complicit in a chain of mistakes that could lead to something far worse. He didn't need to ask Christina if she was ready to hear what he had to say. He already knew she wasn't. She would respond the way she always did, with anger, defiance, and denial. She would claim no one understood her, that everyone was against her, that she was simply trying to protect herself. But the truth she had tried so hard to bury was no longer hidden. Lucky knew everything, not from vague rumors, but from concrete facts, confirmed by those involved and backed by undeniable evidence. The accident Christina caused wasn't a random, unfortunate event, as she insisted. It was the result of blind rage, a moment of recklessness that carried devastating consequences. Maybe Alexis wasn't the intended target, but she was the one paying the price. Alexis wasn't just Christina's mother, she was the woman who had braced herself against every wave of pressure, every legal threat, every public whisper, just to protect her daughter from crumbling under the weight of her own actions. But what infuriated Lucky the most wasn't the accident itself, it was Christina's response. No confession. No remorse. Not even a moment of pause to consider who was suffering in her place. She chose anger. She turned her back on the truth. She betrayed even Alexis, the only person left who was still standing by her side. Lucky wasn't someone who lost his patience easily. But this time, he couldn't endure it any longer. He had watched Alexis fall apart, exhausted and heartbroken from trying to shield a daughter who refused to take responsibility. He had seen Christina spiral deeper into selfishness, clinging to a false image of herself while pushing everyone away. And that's why he knew, if he didn't speak up now, no one else would have the courage to. He wasn't there to pity her. He wasn't there to deliver threats. He was there as someone who had witnessed Alexis's sacrifice and could no longer bear to see it trampled. Christina needed to understand that her time for hiding was over. Secrets always come to light, and if she didn't face them now, the explosion that followed would be far more destructive, not only to her but to everyone still trying to love and protect her, including the mother she continued to take for granted. Lucky knew that after this conversation, Christina might hate him. She would see him as a traitor, the one who shattered the fragile illusion she had built around herself. But he was willing to accept that. Because above all, he understood that true love wasn't about covering up mistakes, it was about forcing someone to confront them, so they could finally grow. And if that required a shock to the system, then he would be the one to deliver it. Not to hurt Christina, but to save her, before it was too late. Third, Jason stood alone in a room bathed in dim, pale light, the weight of the past pressing heavily on his shoulders. It felt as though every memory of sacrifice, every promise made, and every bond once held sacred was rising up all at once, demanding that he make a choice from which there would be no return. This wasn't a simple decision between right and wrong. It was a deeply personal struggle between two core values that had defined him, unwavering loyalty forged through years of devotion, and a moral compass he had never dared to betray. For years, Michael had been like family, more than just a friend, more than just someone from the same complicated Corinthos web. Jason had been there for Michael through every storm, every heartbreak, every threat that loomed over their lives. When Michael asked Jason to protect Sasha and keep her secret, to even go so far as to claim the unborn child as his own in order to shield Michael from the fallout of a custody battle with Willow, Jason agreed without hesitation. He bore the scrutiny, the judgment, the confusion, because his loyalty to Michael came before all else. But now, everything had changed. Sasha's betrayal wasn't just a wound to the heart, it was a knife twisted into the foundation of everything Jason had risked. She hadn't simply walked away. She had chosen to align herself with Sidwell, a dangerous adversary with ties that threatened not only Jason but the entire Corinthos legacy. Her choice was more than personal, it was a declaration of allegiance against everything Jason stood for. And in that betrayal, Jason saw clearly for the first time the consequences of his silence. He realized that continuing to protect the lie meant allowing a chain of deceit to further unravel the lives of innocent people. And at the center of it all was Willow. A mother who had fought death itself to remain in her children's lives. A woman who had been dragged through legal wars, emotional turmoil, and countless betrayals. She had no idea that the child Sasha was carrying, the child Jason claimed as his, was actually Michael's. That truth had the power to change everything. And Jason knew it. Willow deserved to know. Not as a weapon in her custody battle, but as her right. To make informed decisions. To reclaim her agency. To step out of the fog of uncertainty and fight with clarity. Jason could no longer justify withholding that truth, no matter how much it might cost him. Even if it shattered the bond he had with Michael. Even if it brought chaos to the carefully constructed lies everyone had built. Because in the end, protecting a lie, no matter how noble the reason, was still a betrayal of the truth. He wasn't the same man he had been years ago. The man who blindly followed orders, who sacrificed himself without question. Sasha's betrayal had awakened something in him, a realization that loyalty, when blind, could become a burden. That sometimes, truly caring about someone meant forcing them to confront the consequences, not hiding them. He couldn't let Willow keep living a lie. And he couldn't let a child be born into a web of deception. This wasn't just a moral reckoning. It was a moment of identity. Jason knew that once he told the truth, there would be fallout. Michael might never speak to him again. The family might turn against him. But the weight of silence had become unbearable. He could no longer live with the knowledge that his silence was aiding a lie that tore people apart from within. And so, Jason prepared himself for the inevitable. He would go to Willow and tell her everything, that the child Sasha carried was Michael's, not his. That he had protected the truth out of loyalty, but could no longer justify doing so at the cost of justice and clarity. That this truth, painful as it might be, was hers to know. He would risk losing Michael. He would risk losing everything. But he couldn't risk losing himself. Because if Jason continued to live in silence, he would no longer be the man he had fought so hard to become, the man who stood for what was right, who protected the vulnerable, who valued truth above convenience. And in that moment, Jason chose not loyalty, but truth. Fourth, it was becoming nearly impossible to track the shifting tides between Carly and Jason. What was once an unshakable alliance, built on years of trust, silent understanding, and shared sacrifice, was now showing signs of a deepening fracture. The bond that had once withstood betrayals, loss, and even death itself now teetered on the edge of something far more personal and insidious, suspicion. The latest rupture between them occurred on a day that had started with relative calm, but as it so often happened with Carly and Jason, calm was deceptive. Jason, ever the silent protector, had been quietly observing a pattern of inconsistencies surrounding Jocelyn's recent trip to Easter Island and her cryptic involvement with Brenna. While everyone else had accepted Jocelyn's version of events without hesitation, Jason's instincts told him there was something wrong, something being deliberately hidden beneath a layer of convenient storytelling and emotional manipulation. He didn't want to believe it. Jason had always harbored a soft spot for Jocelyn. He watched her grow from a headstrong child into a fiercely independent young woman. But he also knew that fierce independence often came with impulsiveness and recklessness, qualities he had seen before in others, qualities that had led to irreversible consequences. And now, Jocelyn's account of her travels, her interactions with Brenna, and her vague explanations didn't add up. Jason began to wonder if she was lying, not maliciously, but to protect something. Or someone. When Jason brought these concerns to Carly, he did so with measured restraint. He wasn't accusing. He wasn't attacking. He was warning. But the moment his words even hinted at the possibility that Jocelyn was being dishonest, it was as though he had lit a match to a fuse already drenched in gasoline. Carly's reaction was swift, sharp, and emotional. Her eyes, once filled with that familiar fire reserved only for her deepest loyalties, now burned with indignation. She stepped back, as if physically wounded by Jason's words, and her voice, low at first, rose into a crescendo of disbelief and fury. How dare he question her daughter? How dare he suggest that Jocelyn, who had already endured so much loss, would deceive her own mother? For Carly, this wasn't just Jason raising a red flag, it was Jason turning his back on her family. What Jason saw as concern, Carly interpreted as betrayal. She didn't want logic. She didn't want analysis. She didn't want to walk through the details. She wanted Jason to believe in her daughter the way she did, blindly, completely, and without condition. To her, Jason's doubt wasn't just about Jocelyn, it was about her ability as a mother, her judgment, her instinct to protect. But Jason had never been the kind of man to lie to protect feelings, even when those feelings belonged to someone he loved. His loyalty had always come hand in hand with truth, even when that truth hurt. He had seen too much destruction caused by silence, too many lives shattered because people refused to confront the uncomfortable. And now, even as Carly's anger threatened to sever the bond between them, Jason remained firm in his belief that something was off. And that if they didn't get ahead of it, the fallout could be worse than they imagined. Carly, in turn, slammed the door, figuratively, and perhaps permanently. She refused to hear another word. Her mind was made up, her defenses impenetrable. She saw no reason to justify Jocelyn's actions because, to her, no justification was needed. Her daughter was innocent. Full stop. And anyone who questioned that, especially Jason, was no longer on her side. Jason stood in the wake of her fury, the silence that followed more deafening than any argument. He didn't respond. He didn't defend himself. He didn't plead. He simply remained, as he always did, calm in the storm, though this time the storm had a name. Carly. A once unbreakable alliance had suffered another blow, perhaps the deepest yet. And as Jason walked away from the confrontation, there was no telling whether time could mend the widening gap between them, or if this rift would become the final, irreparable divide. What was certain, however, was that the truth, whatever it was no longer just a threat to Jocelyn's story, but to the very foundation of Jason and Carly's long, complicated history.